everyone. Welcome to the Royal Alberta Museum, and thank you for joining us in celebrating Science Literacy Week 2021. This year's theme is C is for Climate, and we're going to explore many interesting stories about climate change. My name is Eleonora Sermoneta. I'm the Adult Learning Programmer here at the Royal Alberta Museum. And today with me, there is Dr. Alwyn Bodoin. She's the Director of Natural History, and she's going to share with us many interesting stories about climate change. But before we go into the climate stories, Alwyn, why don't you tell us something about yourself? And for example, what's your research area and what are you passionate about?
Certainly. Well, I've been here at the museum for 30 years, and my research focus throughout that time has been climate and landscape change, especially as the landscape is the home for people, and people have been here, as you know, for many thousands of years, and we'd like to know what kind of climate and environmental conditions they coped with and what they experienced throughout that interval. One of the best ways of finding out about climate change, especially in the last few hundred years, is through tree cookies. And you can see behind us, we've got a bunch of tree cookies here. Should we go and see what kind of stories they're going to tell us about climate?
Absolutely. All right, here we go. So, Alwyn, what is the connection between tree cookies and climate change?
Well, trees put on a ring every year. So as a tree grows, it puts on a ring each year, and you can count the number of rings and find out how old the tree is. But also, trees that are in places where they're under stress, for instance, temperature stress or moisture stress, they put on wider or narrower rings depending on whether it's a good summer or a bad summer for their growing conditions. And by looking at the pattern of rings and the narrowness and the wideness of the rings and looking at that pattern over time, we can get an idea as to how climate was during the time that this particular tree was growing. And if you look at this one, you can see that this tree was probably growing about 200 years. So this one is not really giving us much climate signal because it's simply wider rings when it's smaller, narrower rings when it's older. But on other trees where the rings show a distinct pattern, we can get a climate signal that goes back a couple of hundred years.
All right, thank you. What about traumatic events like extreme weather, natural disasters? For example, those events, are they captured into tree cookies?
Yes, absolutely. Trees can tell you about life events. So they can tell you about very extreme events, extreme hot summers, extreme cold winters, extreme cold growing seasons. But they can also tell you about things that happen to them. So, for example, let's look at this tree here, this tree cookie, and you can see there are some dark pieces in here, some dark rings in here. Well, this tree has gone through some traumatic events. I broke my arm a few years ago. If you looked at the bones in my arm, you would see evidence of that in the broken bones. Here, we can see evidence that this tree has been afflicted by fire. And so this is a fire scar from when it was in a forest fire, and then it survived, and it has started to grow over the scar. So we can find out when that fire happened by counting back the growth rings, and we can see how old the tree was when it was afflicted by fire by counting out from the middle. So we can get an idea of the fire history. And fire is related to climate, and so by the pattern of fires that trees record in particular areas, we can also get some inferences about climate.
Of course. Thank you very much, Alwyn. So are there other climate stories that you would like to share with us today?
Yes, I have. One of my favorite climate stories, right over here.
So, Alwyn, what are we looking at here?
Well, I'm taking you to one of my favorite places in the world, and this is the Athabasca Glacier. And I am going to tell you the story of a little tree that lived right here, in between the Athabasca Glacier and the Dome Glacier, and the story that it can tell us about climate change. If you were standing here 100 years ago, this whole valley would be filled up by ice. But this little tree was growing here and was recording the history of ice through time. And it was telling us a story about the Little Ice Age. If we just look quickly at this graph, we can see over the last 10,000 years, we've had warmer intervals and we've had colder intervals. And the Little Ice Age is the coldest interval in the last 10,000 years and occurred around, the maximum of the Little Ice Age occurred around 1843 to 1845. And this tree is the one that tells us a lot about what was going on climate-wise around the Athabasca Glacier at that time. So you can see that this tree started growing in 1671, so it's quite an old tree. And then in 1714, the Athabasca Glacier advanced down valley, so we were starting to get into that cold interval. It advanced down valley, and it tilted the tree. And you can see on the diagram that I showed you, the photograph I showed you before, the tree was very close. It tilted, but it didn't die. It was a very tough little tree, and you can see that the rings, instead of being circular, became elliptical. And you can look at the growth pattern on this tree, and between 1680 and 1700, it was growing pretty well. And then when we get past 1800, 1820, 1840, 1860, see how narrow these rings are? That is because it is that little ice age. It's that very cold climate interval. And we can tell from the tree rings from this tree and other trees in this area that the coldest part of this interval was in the mid-1840s. And just after that, in the early 1900s, you can see that the tree was starting to put on wider rings again, reflecting warmer climate as the ice retreated, and the ice has retreated a long way back in the last 100 years. And it was doing very well. It was growing very nicely until 1953, when a researcher came by and cut it down. And that's how we know the story of this particular tree cookie, because we have this one has been very well studied, and we have a lot of information on it. So it tells us a wonderful climate change story. And many other trees in this gallery, there are many other tree rings in this gallery, tree cookies, that will also tell you stories about climate change and how we read the trees and read the landscape in order to understand that story through time.
If you want to learn more about climate, come visit the Royal Alberta Museum and discover more stories, from what pollen can tell us about past climate to how the ice shapes the landscape.
It's Science Literacy Week here at the museum. C is for climate, but we've got a whole alphabet full of science stories here at the museum. So come visit us soon.
Thank you for watching us. Bye.
Bye-bye.